Chapter 26 of The Sea Wolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sea Wolf by Jack London, Chapter 26. Wolf Larsen took the distribution of the whiskey off my hands, and the bottles began to make their appearance while I worked over the fresh batch of wounded men in the forecastle. I had seen whiskey drunk, such as whiskey and soda by the men of the clubs, but never as these men drank it. From pannikins and mugs and from the bottles, great brimming drinks, each one of which was in itself a debauch. But they did not stop at one or two. They drank, and ever the bottles slipped forward and they drank more. Everybody drank. The wounded drank. Oofty, who helped me, drank. Only Lewis refrained, no more than cautiously wetting his lips with the liquor, though he joined in the revels with an abandon equal to that of most of them. It was a saturnalia. In loud voices they shouted over the day's fighting, wrangled about details, or waxed affectionate and made friends with the men whom they had fought. Prisoners and captors hiccuped on one another's shoulders and swore mighty oaths of respect and esteem. They wept over the miseries of the past and over the miseries yet to come under the iron rule of Wolf Larsen, and all cursed him and told terrible tales of his brutality. It was a strange and frightful spectacle, the small, bunk-lined space, the floors and walls leaping and lurching, the dim light, the swaying shadows lengthening and foreshortening monstrously, the thick air heavy with smoke and the smell of bodies and iodoform, and the inflamed faces of the men, half-men I should call them. I noted Oofty, holding the end of a bandage and looking upon the scene, his velvety and luminous eyes glistening in the light like a deer's eyes, and yet I knew the barbaric devil that lurked in his breast and belied all the softness and tenderness, almost womanly, of his face and form. And I noticed the boyish face of Harrison, a good face once but now a demon's, convulsed with passion as he told the newcomers of the hell ship they were in and shrieked curses upon the head of Wolf Larsen. Wolf Larsen it was, always Wolf Larsen, enslaver and tormentor of men, a male Circe, and these as swine, suffering brutes that grovelled before him and revolted only in drunkenness and in secrecy. And was I, too, one of his swine, I thought? And Maud Brewster? No. I ground my teeth in my anger and determination till the man I was attending winced under my hand, and Oofty looked at me with curiosity. I felt endowed with a sudden strength. What of my new-found love, I was a giant. I feared nothing. I would work my will through it all, in spite of Wolf Larsen and of my own 35 bookish years. All would be well. I would make it well. And so, exalted, upborne by a sense of power, I turned my back on the howling inferno and climbed to the deck, where the fog drifted ghostly through the night and the air was sweet and pure and quiet. The steerage, where were 2 wounded hunters, was a repetition of the forecastle, except that Wolf Larsen was not being cursed, and it was with a great relief that I again emerged on deck and went aft to the cabin. Supper was ready, and Wolf Larsen and Maud were waiting for me. While all his ship was getting drunk as fast as it could, he remained sober. Not a drop of liquor passed his lips. He did not dare it under the circumstances, for he had only Lewis and me to depend upon, and Lewis even now was at the wheel. We were sailing on through the fog without a lookout and without lights. That Wolf Larsen had turned the liquor loose among his men surprised me, but he evidently knew their psychology and the best method of cementing in cordiality what had begun in bloodshed. His victory over Death Larsen seemed to have had a remarkable effect upon him. The previous evening he had reasoned himself into the blues, and I had been waiting momentarily for one of his characteristic outbursts. Yet nothing had occurred, and he was now in splendid trim. Possibly his success in capturing so many hunters and boats had counteracted the customary reaction. At any rate, the blues were gone, and the blue devils had not put in an appearance. So I thought at the time, but, ah me, little I knew him, or knew that even then, perhaps, he was meditating an outbreak more terrible than any I had seen. As I say, he discovered himself in splendid trim when I entered the cabin. He had had no headaches for weeks, his eyes were clear blue as the sky, his bronze was beautiful with perfect health. Life swelled through his veins in full and magnificent flood. While waiting for me, he had engaged Maud in animated discussion. Temptation was the topic they had hit upon, and from the few words I heard I made out that he was contending that temptation was temptation only when a man was seduced by it and fell. For look you, he was saying, as I see it, a man does things because of desire. He has many desires. He may desire to escape pain or to enjoy pleasure. But whatever he does because he desires to do it. But suppose he desires to do two opposite things, neither of which will permit him to do the other, Maud interrupted. The very thing I was coming to, he said. And between these two desires is just where the soul of the man is manifest, she went on. If it is a good soul, it will desire and do the good action, and the contrary if it is a bad soul. It is the soul that decides. Bosh and nonsense, he exclaimed impatiently. It is the desire that decides. Here is a man who wants to, say, get drunk. Also, he doesn't want to get drunk. What does he do? How does he do it? He is a puppet. He is the creature of his desires, and of the two desires he obeys the strongest one, that is all. His soul hasn't anything to do with it. How can he be tempted to get drunk and refuse to get drunk? If the desire to remain sober prevails, it is because it is the strongest desire. Temptation plays no part unless... He paused while grasping the new thought which had come into his mind. Unless he is tempted to remain sober. Ha ha, he laughed. What do you think of that, Mr. Van Weyden? That both of you are hair-splitting, I said. The man's soul is his desires. Or, if you will, the sum of his desires is his soul. Therein you are both wrong. You lay the stress upon the desire apart from the soul. Miss Brewster lays the stress of the soul apart from the desire, and in point of fact soul and desire are the same thing. However, I continued, Miss Brewster is right in contending that temptation is temptation whether the man yield or overcome. Fire is fanned by the wind until it leaps up fiercely. So is desire like fire. It is fanned, as by a wind, by sight of the thing desired, or by a new and luring description or comprehension of the thing desired. There lies the temptation. It is the wind that fans the desire until it leaps up to mastery. That's temptation. It may not fan sufficiently to make the desire overmastering, but in so far as it fans at all, that far is it temptation. And, as you say, it may tempt for good as well as for evil. I felt proud of myself as we sat down to the table. My words had been decisive. At least they had put an end to the discussion. But Wolf Larsen seemed voluble, prone to speech as I had never seen him before. It was as if he were bursting with pent energy which must find an outlet somehow. Almost immediately he launched into a discussion on love. As usual, his was the sheer materialistic side, and Maud's was the idealistic. For myself, beyond a word or so of suggestion or correction now and again, I took no part. He was brilliant, but so was Maud, and for some time I lost the thread of the conversation through studying her face as she talked. It was a face that rarely displayed color, but tonight it was flushed and vivacious. Her wit was playing keenly, and she was enjoying the tilt as much as Wolf Larsen, and he was enjoying it hugely. For some reason, though I know not why in the argument, so utterly had I lost it in the contemplation of one stray brown lock of Maud's hair, he quoted from Isolde at Tintagel, where she says, Blessed am I beyond woman even herein, that beyond all born women is my sin, and perfect my transgression. As he had read pessimism into Omar, so now he read triumph, stinging triumph and exultation into Swinburne's lines. And he read rightly, and he read well. He had hardly ceased reading when Lewis put his head into the companionway and whispered down, "Be easy, will ye? The fog's lifted, and 'tis the port light of a steamer that's crossin' our bow this blessed minute." Wolf Larsen sprang on deck, and so swiftly that by the time we followed him he had pulled the steerage slide over the drunken clamor and was on his way forward to close the forecastle scuttle. The fog, though it remained, had lifted high where it obscured the stars and made the night quite black. Directly ahead of us I could see a bright red light and a white light, and I could hear the pulsing of a steamer's engines. Beyond a doubt it was the Macedonia. Wolf Larsen had returned to the poop, and we stood in a silent group watching the lights rapidly cross our bow. "Lucky for me she doesn't carry a searchlight," Wolf Larsen said. "What if I should cry out loudly?" I queried in a whisper. "It would be all up," he answered. "But have you thought upon what would immediately happen?" Before I had time to express any desire to know, he had me by the throat with his gorilla grip, and by a faint quiver of the muscles, a hint, as it were, he suggested to me the twist that would surely have broken my neck. The next moment he had released me, and we were gazing at the Macedonia's lights. "What if I should cry out?" Maud asked. "I like you too well to hurt you," he said softly. Nay, there was a tenderness and a caress in his voice that made me wince. "But don't do it, just the same, for I'd promptly break Mr. Van Weyden's neck." "Then she has my permission to cry out," I said defiantly. "I hardly think you'd care to sacrifice the Dean of American Letters the second," he sneered. We spoke no more, though we had become too used to one another for the silence to be awkward, and when the red light and the white had disappeared we returned to the cabin to finish the interrupted supper. Again they fell to quoting, and Maud gave Dowson's Impenitent Ultima. She rendered it beautifully, but I watched not her but Wolf Larsen. I was fascinated by the fascinated look he bent upon Maud. He was quite out of himself, and I noticed the unconscious movement of his lips as he shaped word for word as fast as she uttered them. He interrupted her when she gave the lines, "And her eyes should be my light while the sun went out behind me, and the viols and her voice should be the last sound in my ear." "There are viols in your voice," he said bluntly, and his eyes flashed their golden light. I could have shouted with joy at her control. She finished the concluding stanza without faltering, and then slowly guided the conversation into less perilous channels. And all the while I sat in a half daze, the drunken riot of the steerage breaking through the bulkhead, the man I feared and the woman I loved talking on and on. The table was not cleared. The man who had taken Mugridge's place had evidently joined his comrades in the forecastle. If ever Wolf Larsen attained the summit of living, he attained it then. From time to time I forsook my own thoughts to follow him, and I followed in amaze, mastered for the moment by his remarkable intellect, under the spell of his passion, for he was preaching the passion of revolt. It was inevitable that Milton's Lucifer should be instanced, and the keenness with which Wolf Larsen analyzed and depicted the character was a revelation of his stifled genius. It reminded me of Taine, yet I knew the man had never heard of that brilliant, though dangerous thinker. He led a lost cause, and he was not afraid of God's thunderbolts, Wolf Larsen was saying. Hurled into hell, he was unbeaten. A third of God's angels he had led with him, and straightway he incited man to rebel against God, and gain for himself in hell the major portion of all the generations of man. Why was he beaten out of heaven? Because he was less brave than God? Less proud? Less aspiring? No, 1,000 times no. God was more powerful, as he said, whom thunder hath made greater. But Lucifer was a free spirit. To serve was to suffocate. He preferred suffering and freedom to all the happiness of a comfortable servility. He did not care to serve God. He cared to serve nothing. He was no figurehead. He stood on his own legs. He was an individual. "The first anarchist," Maud laughed, rising and preparing to withdraw to her stateroom. "Then it is good to be an anarchist," he cried. He too had risen, and he stood facing her, for she had paused at the door of her room as he went on. "Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." It was the defiant cry of a mighty spirit. The cabin still rang with his voice as he stood there, swaying, his bronze face shining, his head up and dominant, and his eyes, golden and masculine, intensely masculine and intensely soft, flashing upon Maud at the door. Again that unnameable and unmistakable terror was in her eyes, and she said, almost in a whisper, "You are Lucifer." The door closed and she was gone. He stood staring after her for a minute, then returned to himself and to me. "I'll relieve Louis at the wheel," he said shortly, "and call upon you to relieve at midnight. Better turn in now and get some sleep." He pulled on a pair of mittens, put on his cap, and ascended the companion stairs, while I followed his suggestion by going to bed. For some unknown reason, prompt mysteriously, I did not undress, but lay down fully clothed. For a time I listened to the clamor and the steerage and marveled upon the love which had come to me, but my sleep on the Ghost had become most healthful and natural, and soon the songs and cries died away, my eyes closed, and my consciousness sank down into the half-death of slumber. I knew not what had aroused me, but I found myself out of my bunk, on my feet, wide awake, my soul vibrating to the warning of danger as it might have thrilled to a trumpet call. I threw open the door. The cabin light was burning low. I saw Maud, my Maud, straining and struggling and crushed in the embrace of Wolf Larsen's arms. I could see the vain beat and flutter of her as she strove, pressing her face against his breast, to escape from him. All this I saw in the very instant of seeing, and as I sprang forward. I struck him with my fist on the face as he raised his head, but it was a puny blow. He roared in a ferocious, animal-like way, and gave me a shove with his hand. It was only a shove, a flirt of the wrist, yet so tremendous was his strength that I was hurled backwards as from a catapult. I struck the door of the stateroom which had formerly been Mugridge's, splintering and smashing the panels with the impact of my body. I struggled to my feet, with difficulty dragging myself clear of the wrecked door, unaware of any hurt whatever. I was conscious only of an overmastering rage. I think I, too, cried aloud as I drew the knife at my hip and sprang forward a second time. But something had happened. They were reeling apart. I was close upon him, my knife uplifted, but I withheld the blow. I was puzzled by the strangeness of it. Maud was leaning against the wall, one hand out for support, but he was staggering, his left hand pressed against his forehead and covering his eyes, and with his right he was groping about him in a dazed sort of way. It struck against the wall, and his body seemed to express a muscular and physical relief at the contact, as though he had found his bearings, his location in space, as well as something against which to lean. Then I saw red again. All my wrongs and humiliations flashed upon me with a dazzling brightness, all that I had suffered and others had suffered at his hands, all the enormity of the man's very existence. I sprang upon him, blindly, insanely, and drove the knife into his shoulder. I knew then that it was no more than a flesh wound. I had felt the steel grate on his shoulder blade, and I raised the knife to strike at a more vital part. But Maud has seen my first blow, and she cried, "Don't! Please don't!" I dropped my arm for a moment, and a moment only. Again the knife was raised, and Wolf Larsen would have surely died had she not stepped between. Her arms were around me, her hair was brushing my face. My pulse rushed up in an unwonted manner, yet my rage mounted with it. She looked me bravely in the eyes. "For my sake," she begged. "I would kill him for your sake," I cried, trying to free my arm without hurting her. "Hush," she said, and laid her fingers lightly on my lips. I could have kissed them had I dared, even then, in my rage. The touch of them was so sweet, so very sweet. "Please, please," she pleaded, and she disarmed me by the words, as I was to discover they would ever disarm me. I stepped back, separating from her, and replaced the knife in its sheath. I looked at Wolf Larsen. He still pressed his left hand against his forehead. It covered his eyes. His head was bowed. He seemed to have grown limp. His body was sagging at the hips, his great shoulders were drooping and shrinking forward. "Van Weyden!" he called hoarsely, and with a note of fright in his voice. "Oh, Van Weyden, where are you?" I looked at Maud. She did not speak, but nodded her head. "Here I am," I answered, stepping to his side. "What is the matter?" "Help me to a seat," he said in the same hoarse, frightened voice. "I am a sick man, a very sick man, Hump," he said as he left my sustaining grip and sank into a chair. His head dropped forward on the table and was buried in his hands. From time to time it rocked back and forward as with pain. Once, when he half raised it, I saw the sweat standing in heavy drops on his forehead about the roots of his hair. "I am a sick man, a very sick man," he repeated again, and yet once again. "What is the matter?" I asked, resting my hand on his shoulder. "What can I do for you?" But he shook my hand off with an irritated movement, and for a long time I stood by his side in silence. Maud was looking on, her face awed and frightened. What had happened to him we could not imagine. "Hump," he said at last, "I must get into my bunk. Lend me a hand. I'll be all right in a little while. It's these damned headaches, I believe. I was afraid of them. I had a feeling—no, I don't know what I'm talking about. Help me into my bunk." But when we got him into his bunk, he again buried his face in his hands, covering his eyes, and as I turned to go I could hear him murmuring, "I am a sick man, a very sick man." Maud looked at me inquiringly as I emerged. I shook my head, saying, "Something has happened to him. What, I don't know. He is helpless and frightened, I imagine, for the first time in his life. It must have occurred before he received the knife thrust, which made only a superficial wound. You must have seen what happened." She shook her head. "I saw nothing. It is just as mysterious to me. He suddenly released me and staggered away. But what shall we do? What shall I do?" "If you will wait, please, until I come back," I answered. I went on deck. Louis was at the wheel. "You may go for'ard and turn in," I said, taking it from him. He was quick to obey, and I found myself alone on the deck of the Ghost. As quietly as was possible, I clewed up the topsails, lowered the flying jib and staysail, backed the jib over, and flattened the mainsail. Then I went below to Maud. I placed my finger on my lips for silence and entered Wolf Larsen's room. He was in the same position in which I had left him, and his head was rocking, almost writhing, from side to side. "Anything I can do for you?" I asked. He made no reply at first, but on my repeating the question he answered, "No, no, I'm all right. Leave me alone till morning." But as I turned to go I noted that his head had resumed its rocking motion. Maud was waiting patiently for me, and I took notice, with a thrill of joy, of the queenly poise of her head and her glorious, calm eyes. Calm and sure they were as her spirit itself. "Will you trust yourself to me for a journey of 600 miles or so?" I asked. "You mean she asked, and I knew she had guessed aright. "Yes, I mean just that. There is nothing left for us but the open boat." "For me, you mean," she said. "You are certainly as safe as you have been." "No, there is nothing left for us but the open boat," I iterated stoutly. "Will you please dress as warmly as you can, at once, and make into a bundle whatever you wish to bring with you. And make all haste," I added, as she turned toward her stateroom. The lazarette was directly beneath the cabin, and opening the trapdoor in the floor and carrying a candle with me, I dropped down and began overhauling the ship's stores. I selected mainly from the canned goods, and by the time I was ready, willing hands were extended from above to receive what I passed up. We worked in silence. I helped myself also to blankets, mittens, oilskins, caps, and such things from the slop chest. It was no light adventure, this trusting ourselves in a small boat to so raw and stormy a sea, and it was imperative that we should guard ourselves against the cold and wet. We worked feverishly at carrying our plunder on deck and depositing amidships, so feverishly that Maud, whose strength was hardly a positive quantity, had to give over, exhausted, and sit on the steps at the break of the poop. This did not serve to recover her, and she lay on her back on the hard deck, arms stretched out and whole body relaxed. It was a trick I remembered of my sister, and I knew she would soon be herself again. I knew also that weapons would not come in amiss, and I re-entered Wolf Larsen's stateroom to get his rifle and shotgun. I spoke to him, but he made no answer, though his head was still rocking from side to side, and he was not asleep. "Goodbye, Lucifer," I whispered to myself as I softly closed the door. Next to obtain was a stock of ammunition, an easy matter, though I had to enter the storage companionway to do it. Here the hunters stored the ammunition boxes they carried in the boats, and here, but a few feet from the noisy revels, I took possession of 2 boxes. Next, to lower a boat. Not so simple a task for one man. Having cast off the lashings, I hoisted first on the forward tackle, then on the aft, till the boat cleared the rail, when I lowered away one tackle and then the other, for a couple of feet, till it hung snugly, above the water, against the schooner's side. I made certain that it contained the proper equipment of oars, rowlocks, and sail. Water was a consideration, and I robbed every boat aboard of its breaker. As there were 9 boats all told, it meant that we should have plenty of water and ballast as well, though there was a chance that the boat would be overloaded, what of the generous supplies of other things I was taking. While Maud was passing me the provisions and I was storing them in the boat, a sailor came on deck from the forecastle. He stood by the weather rail for a while (we were lowering over the lee rail), and then sauntered slowly amidships, where he again paused and stood facing the wind with his back toward us. I could hear my heart beating as I crouched low in the boat. Maud had sunk down upon the deck and was, I knew, lying motionless, her body in the shadow of the bulwark. But the man never turned, and after stretching his arms above his head and yawning audibly, he retraced his steps to the forecastle scuttle and disappeared. A few minutes sufficed to finish the loading, and I lowered the boat into the water. As I helped Maud over the rail and felt her form close to mine, it was all I could do to keep from crying out, "I love you, I love you." Truly Humphrey Van Weyden was at last in love, I thought, as her fingers clung to mine while I lowered her down to the boat. I held on to the rail with one hand and supported her weight with the other, and I was proud at the moment of the feat. It was a strength I had not possessed a few months before, on the day I said goodbye to Charlie Furuseth and started for San Francisco on the ill-fated Martinez. As the boat ascended on a sea, her feet touched and I released her hands. I cast off the tackles and leaped after her. I had never rowed in my life, but I put out the oars and at the expense of much effort got the boat clear of the Ghost. Then I experimented with the sail. I had seen the boat steerers and hunters set their sprit sails many times, yet this was my first attempt. What took them possibly 2 minutes took me 20, but in the end I succeeded in setting and trimming it, and with the steering oar in my hand hauled on the wind. "There lies Japan," I remarked, "straight before us." "Humphrey Van Weyden," she said, "you are a brave man." "Nay," I answered, "it is you who are a brave woman." We turned our heads, swayed by a common impulse to see the last of the Ghost. Her low hull lifted and rolled to windward on the sea, her canvas loomed darkly in the night, her lashed wheel creaked as the rudder kicked, then sight and sound of her faded away, and we were alone on the dark sea. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Sea Wolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sea Wolf by Jack London. Chapter 27. Day broke grey and chill. The boat was close hauled on a fresh breeze, and the compass indicated that we were just making the course which would bring us to Japan. Though stoutly mittened, my fingers were cold, and they pained from the grip on the steering oar. My feet were stinging from the bite of the frost, and I hoped fervently that the sun would shine. Before me, in the bottom of the boat, lay Maud. She, at least, was warm, for under her and over her were thick blankets. The top one I had drawn over her face to shelter it from the night, so I could see nothing but the vague shape of her, and her light brown hair, escaped from the covering and jewelled with moisture from the air. Long I looked at her, dwelling upon that one visible bit of her as only a man would who deemed it the most precious thing in the world. So insistent was my gaze that at last she stirred under the blankets, the top fold was thrown back, and she smiled out on me, her eyes yet heavy with sleep. "Good morning, Mr. Van Weyden," she said. "Have you sighted land yet?" "No," I said, "but we are approaching it at a rate of 6 miles an hour." She made a moue of disappointment. "But that is equivalent to 144 miles in 24 hours," I added reassuringly. Her face brightened. "And how far have we to go?" "Siberia lies off there," I said, pointing to the west. "But to the southwest, some 600 miles, is Japan. And if this wind should hold, we'll make it in 5 days." "And if it storms, the boat could not live?" She had a way of looking one in the eyes and demanding the truth, and thus she looked at me as she asked the question. "It would have to storm very hard," I temporized. "And if it storms very hard?" I nodded my head. "But we may be picked up any moment by a sealing schooner. They are plentifully distributed over this part of the ocean." "Why, you are chilled through!" she cried. "Look, you are shivering. Don't deny it, you are. And here I have been lying warm as toast." "I don't see that it would help matters if you too sat up and were chilled," I laughed. "It will, though, when I learn to steer, which I certainly shall." She sat up and began making her simple toilet. She shook down her hair, and it fell about her in a brown cloud, hiding her face and shoulders. Dear, damp, brown hair. I wanted to kiss it, to ripple it through my fingers, to bury my face in it. I gazed entranced till the boat ran into the wind, and the flapping sail warned me I was not attending to my duties. Idealist and romantic that I was, and always have been in spite of my analytical nature, yet I had failed till now in grasping much of the physical characteristics of love. The love of man and woman, I had always held, was a sublimated something related to spirit, a spiritual bond that linked and drew their souls together. The bonds of the flesh had little part in my cosmos of love. But I was learning the sweet lesson for myself that the soul transmuted itself, expressed itself, through the flesh, that the sight and sense and touch of the loved one's hair was as much breath and voice and essence of the spirit as the light that shone from the eyes and the thoughts that fell from the lips. After all, pure spirit was unknowable, a thing to be sensed and divined only, nor could it express itself in terms of itself. Jehovah was anthropomorphic because he could address himself to the Jews only in terms of their understanding, so he was conceived as in their own image, as a cloud, a pillar of fire, a tangible physical something which the mind of the Israelites could grasp. And so I gazed upon Maud's light brown hair and loved it, and learned more of love than all the poets and singers had taught me with all their songs and sonnets. She flung it back with a sudden adroit movement, and her face emerged, smiling. "Why don't women wear their hair down always?" I asked. "It is so much more beautiful." "If it didn't tangle so dreadfully," she laughed. "There, I've lost one of my precious hairpins." I neglected the boat and had the sail spilling the wind again and again, such was my delight in following her every movement as she searched through the blankets for the pin. I was surprised and joyfully that she was so much the woman, and the display of each trait and mannerism that was characteristically feminine gave me keener joy. For I had been elevating her too highly in my concepts of her, removing her too far from the plane of the human, and too far from me. I had been making of her a creature goddess-like and unapproachable. So I hailed with delight the little traits that proclaimed her only woman after all, such as the toss of the head which flung back the cloud of hair and the search for the pin. She was woman, my kind, on my plane, and the delightful intimacy of kind, of man and woman, was possible, as well as the reverence and awe in which I knew I should always hold her. She found the pin with an adorable little cry, and I turned my attention more fully to my steering. I proceeded to experiment lashing and wedging the steering oar until the boat held up fairly well by the wind without my assistance. Occasionally it came up too close or fell off too freely, but it always recovered itself and in the main behaved satisfactorily. "And now we shall have breakfast," I said, "but first you must be more warmly clad." I got out a heavy shirt, new from the slop chest, and made from blanket goods. I knew the kind, so thick and so close of texture that it could resist the rain and not be soaked through after hours of wetting. When she had slipped this on over her head, I exchanged the boy's cap she wore for a man's cap, large enough to cover her hair, and when the flap was turned down to completely cover her neck and ears. The effect was charming. Her face was of the sort that could not but look well under all circumstances. Nothing could destroy its exquisite oval, its well-nigh classic lines, its delicately stenciled brows, its large brown eyes, clear-seeing and calm, gloriously calm. A puff, slightly stronger than usual, struck us just then. The boat was caught as it obliquely crossed the crest of a wave. It went over suddenly, burying its gunwale level with the sea and shipping a bucketful or so of water. I was opening a can of tongue at the moment, and I sprang to the sheet and cast it off just in time. The sail flapped and fluttered and the boat paid off. A few minutes of regulating sufficed to put it on its course again when I returned to the preparation of breakfast. "It does very well, it seemed, though I am not versed in things nautical," she said, nodding her head with grave approval at my steering contrivance. "But it will serve only when we are sailing by the wind," I explained. "When running more freely, with the wind astern, abeam, or on the quarter, it will be necessary for me to steer." "I must say I don't understand your technicalities," she said. "But I do your conclusion, and I don't like it. You cannot steer night and day and forever. So I shall expect, after breakfast, to receive my first lesson. And then you shall lie down and sleep. We'll stand watches just as they do on ships." "I don't see how I am to teach you," I made protest. "I am just learning for myself. You little thought when you trusted yourself to me that I had had no experience whatsoever with small boats. This is the first time I have ever been in one." "Then we'll learn together, sir, and since you've had a night start you shall teach me what you have learned. And now breakfast. My, this air does give one an appetite." "No coffee," I said regretfully, passing her buttered sea biscuits and a slice of canned tongue. "And there will be no tea, no soups, nothing hot, till we have made land somewhere somehow." After the simple breakfast, capped with a cup of cold water, Maud took her lesson in steering. In teaching her, I learned quite a deal myself, though I was applying the knowledge already acquired by sailing the Ghost and by watching the boat steerers sail the small boats. She was an apt pupil, and soon learned to keep the course, to luff in the puffs, and to cast off the sheet in an emergency. Having grown tired, apparently, of the task, she relinquished the oar to me. I had folded up the blankets, but she now proceeded to spread them out on the bottom. When all was arranged snugly, she said, "And now, sir, to bed, and you shall sleep until luncheon. Till dinner time," she corrected, remembering the arrangement on the Ghost. What could I do? She insisted and said, "Please, please," whereupon I turned the oar over to her and obeyed. I experienced a positive sensuous delight as I crawled into the bed she had made with her hands. The calm and control which were so much a part of her seemed to have been communicated to the blankets, so that I was aware of a soft dreaminess and content, and of an oval face and brown eyes framed in a fisherman's cap and tossing against a background now of grey cloud, now of grey sea, and then I was aware that I had been asleep. I looked at my watch. It was 1 o'clock. I had slept 7 hours, and she had been steering 7 hours. When I took the steering oar, I had first to unbend her cramped fingers. Her modicum of strength had been exhausted, and she was unable even to move from her position. I was compelled to let go the sheet while I helped her to the nest of blankets and chafed her hands and arms. "I am so tired," she said with a quick intake of the breath and a sigh, drooping her head wearily. But she straightened it the next moment. "Now don't scold, don't you dare scold," she cried with mock defiance. "I hope my face does not appear angry," I answered seriously, "for I assure you I am not in the least angry." "No, no," she considered. "It looks only reproachful." "Then it is an honest face, for it looks what I feel. You were not fair to yourself, nor to me. How can I ever trust you again?" She looked penitent. "I'll be good," she said, as a naughty child might say it. "I promise." "To obey as a sailor would obey his captain?" "Yes," she answered. "It was stupid of me, I know." "Then you must promise something else," I ventured. "Readily." "That you must not say 'please, please' too often, for when you do you are sure to override my authority." She laughed with amused appreciation. She too had noticed the power of the repeated "please." "It is a good word," I began. "But I must not overwork it," she broke in. But she laughed weakly, and her head drooped again. I left the oar long enough to tuck the blankets about her feet and to pull a single fold across her face. Alas, she was not strong. I looked with misgiving toward the southwest and thought of the 600 miles of hardship before us, if it were no worse than a hardship. On this sea a storm might blow up at any moment and destroy us. And yet I was unafraid. I was without confidence in the future, extremely doubtful, and yet I felt no underlying fear. "It must come right, it must come right," I repeated to myself over and over again. The wind freshened in the afternoon, raising a stiffer sea and trying the boat and me severely. But the supply of food and the 9 breakers of water enabled the boat to stand up to the sea and wind, and I held on as long as I dared. Then I removed the sprit, tightly hauling down the beak of the sail, and we raced along under what sailors call a leg of mutton. Late in the afternoon I sighted a steamer's smoke on the horizon to leeward, and I knew it either for a Russian cruiser or, more likely, the Macedonia still seeking the Ghost. The sun had not shone all day, and it had been bitter cold. As night drew on, the clouds darkened and the wind freshened, so that when Maud and I ate supper it was with our mittens on and with me still steering and eating morsels between puffs. By the time it was dark, wind and sea had become too strong for the boat, and I reluctantly took in the sail and set about making a drag or sea anchor. I had learned the device from the talk of the hunters, and it was a simple thing to manufacture. Furling the sail and lashing it securely about the mast, boom, sprit, and 2 pairs of spare oars, I threw it overboard. A line connected it with the bow, and as it floated low in the water, practically unexposed to the wind, it drifted less rapidly than the boat. In consequence, it held the boat bow on to the sea and wind, the safest position in which to escape being swamped when the sea is breaking into whitecaps. "And now?" Maud asked cheerfully when the task was accomplished and I pulled on my mittens. "And now we are no longer traveling toward Japan," I answered. "Our drift is to the southeast or south-southeast at the rate of at least 2 miles an hour." "That will be only 24 miles," she urged, "if the wind remains high all night." "Yes, and only 140 miles if it continues for 3 days and nights." "But it won't continue," she said with easy confidence. "It will turn around and blow fair." "The sea is the great faithless one." "But the wind," she retorted. "I have heard you grow eloquent over the brave trade wind." "I wish I had thought to bring Wolf Larsen's chronometer and sextant," I said, still gloomily. "Sailing one direction, drifting another direction, to say nothing of the set of the current in some third direction, makes a resultant which dead reckoning can never calculate. Before long we won't know where we are by 500 miles. Then I begged her pardon and promised I should not be disheartened any more. At her solicitation I let her take the watch till midnight. It was then 9 o'clock, but I wrapped her in blankets and put an oilskin about her before I lay down. I slept only cat naps. The boat was leaping and pounding as it fell over the crests. I could hear the seas rushing past, and spray was continually being thrown aboard. And still, it was not a bad night, I mused. Nothing of the nights I had been through on the Ghost. Nothing, perhaps, of the nights we should go through in this cockle shell. Its planking was 3/4 of an inch thick. Between us and the bottom of the sea was less than an inch of wood. And yet, I aver it, and I aver it again, I was unafraid. The death which Wolf Larsen and even Thomas Mugridge had made me fear, I no longer feared. The coming of Maud Brewster into my life seemed to have transformed me. After all, I thought, it is better and finer to love than to be loved, if it makes something in life so worth while that one is not loath to die for it. I forget my own life in the love of another life, and yet, such is the paradox, I never wanted so much to live as right now when I place the least value on my own life. I never had so much reason for living, was my concluding thought, and after that, until I dozed, I contented myself with trying to pierce the darkness to where I knew Maud crouched low in the stern sheets, watchful of the foaming sea and ready to call me on an instant's notice. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Sea Wolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sea Wolf by Jack London. Chapter 28. There is no need of going into an extended recital of our suffering in the small boat during the many days we were driven and drifted, here and there, willy-nilly, across the ocean. The high wind blew from the northwest for 24 hours, when it fell calm, and in the night sprang up from the southwest. This was dead in our teeth, but I took in the sea anchor and set sail, hauling a course on the wind which took us in a south-southeasterly direction. It was an even choice between this and the west-northwesterly course which the wind permitted, but the warm airs of the south fanned my desire for a warmer sea and swayed my decision. In 3 hours, it was midnight I well remember, and as dark as I had ever seen it on the sea, the wind, blowing still out of the southwest, rose furiously, and once again I was compelled to set the sea anchor. Day broke and found me one-eyed and the ocean lashed white, the boat pitching, almost on end, to its drag. We were in imminent danger of being swamped by the whitecaps. As it was, spray and spume came aboard in such quantities that I bailed without cessation. The blankets were soaking. Everything was wet except Maud, and she, in oilskins, rubber boots, and sou'wester, was dry, all but her face and hands and a spray wisp of hair. She relieved me at the bailing hole from time to time, and bravely she threw out the water and faced the storm. All things are relative. It was no more than a stiff blow, but to us, fighting for life in our frail craft, it was indeed a storm. Cold and cheerless, the wind beating on our faces, the white seas roaring by, we struggled through the day. Night came, but neither of us slept. Day came, and still the wind beat on our faces, and the white seas roared past. By the second night Maud was falling asleep from exhaustion. I covered her with oilskins and a tarpaulin. She was comparatively dry, but she was numb with the cold. I feared greatly that she might die in the night, but day broke, cold and cheerless, with the same clouded sky and beating wind and roaring seas. I had had no sleep for 48 hours. I was wet and chilled to the marrow till I felt more dead than alive. My body was stiff with exertion as well as from cold, and my aching muscles gave me the severest torture whenever I used them, and I used them continually. And all the time we were being driven off into the northeast, directly away from Japan and toward bleak Bering Sea. And still we lived, and the boat lived, and the wind blew unabated. In fact, toward nightfall of the third day it increased a trifle and something more. The boat's bow plunged under a crest, and we came through quarter-full of water. I bailed like a madman. The liability of shipping another such sea was enormously increased by the water that weighed the boat down and robbed it of its buoyancy. And another such sea meant the end. When I had the boat empty again, I was forced to take away the tarpaulin which covered Maud, in order that I might lash it down across the bow. It was well I did, for it covered the boat fully a third of the way aft, and 3 times, in the next several hours, it flung off the bulk of the down-rushing water when the bow shoved under the seas. Maud's condition was pitiable. She sat crouched in the bottom of the boat, her lips blue, her face gray, and plainly showing the pain she suffered. But ever her eyes looked bravely at me, and ever her lips uttered brave words. The worst of the storm must have blown that night, though little I noticed it. I had succumbed and slept where I sat in the stern sheets. The morning of the 4th day found the wind diminished to a gentle whisper, the sea dying down, and the sun shining upon us. Oh, the blessed sun! How we bathed our poor bodies in its delicious warmth, reviving like bugs and crawling things after a storm. We smiled again, said amusing things, and waxed optimistic over our situation. Yet it was, if anything, worse than ever. We were farther from Japan than the night we left the Ghost. Nor could I more than roughly guess our latitude and longitude. At a calculation of a 2-mile drift per hour, during the 70 and odd hours of the storm, we had been driven at least 150 miles to the northeast. But was such a calculated drift correct? For all I knew, it might have been 4 miles per hour instead of 2, in which case we were another 150 miles to the bad. Where we were I did not know, though there was quite a likelihood that we were in the vicinity of the Ghost. There were seals about us, and I was prepared to sight a sealing schooner at any time. We did sight one in the afternoon, when the northwest breeze had sprung up freshly once more. But the strange schooner lost itself on the skyline, and we alone occupied the circle of the sea. Came days of fog, when even Maud's spirit drooped and there were no merry words upon her lips; days of calm, when we floated on the lonely immensity of the sea, oppressed by its greatness and yet marvelling at the miracle of tiny life, for we still lived and struggled to live; days of sleet and wind and snow squalls, when nothing could keep us warm, or days of drizzling rain, when we filled our water breakers from the drip of the wet sail. And ever I loved Maud with an increasing love. She was so many-sided, so many-mooded, protean-mooded, I called her. But I called her this and other and dearer things in my thoughts only. Though the declaration of my love urged and trembled on my tongue 1,000 times, I knew that it was no time for such a declaration. If for no other reason, it was no time, when one was protecting and trying to save a woman, to ask that woman for her love. Delicate as was the situation, and not alone in this but other ways, I flattered myself that I was able to deal delicately with it, and also I flattered myself that by look or sign I gave no advertisement of the love I felt for her. We were like good comrades, and we grew better comrades as the days went by. One thing about her which surprised me was her lack of timidity and fear. The terrible sea, the frail boat, the storms, the suffering, the strangeness and isolation of the situation, all that should have frightened a robust woman, seemed to make no impression upon her who had known a life only in its most sheltered and consummately artificial aspects, and who was herself all fire and dew and mist, sublimated spirit, all that was soft and tender and clinging in woman. And yet I am wrong. She was timid and afraid, but she possessed courage. The flesh and the qualms of the flesh she was heir to, but the flesh bore heavily only on the flesh. And she was spirit, first and always spirit, etherealized essence of life, calm as her calm eyes, and sure of permanence in the changing order of the universe. Came days of storm, days and nights of storm, when the ocean menaced us with its roaring whiteness, and the wind smote our struggling boat with the Titan's buffets, and ever we were flung off farther and farther to the northeast. It was in such a storm, and the worst that we had experienced, that I cast a weary glance to leeward, not in quest of anything, but more from the weariness of facing the elemental strife, and in mute appeal, almost, to the wrathful powers to cease and let us be. What I saw I could not at first believe. Days and nights of sleeplessness and anxiety had doubtless turned my head. I looked back at Maud, to identify myself, as it were, in time and space. The sight of her dear wet cheeks, her flying hair, and her brave brown eyes convinced me that my vision was still healthy. Again I turned my face to leeward, and again I saw the jutting promontory, black and high and naked, the raging surf that broke about its base and beat its front high up with spouting fountains, the black and forbidden coastline running towards the southeast and fringed with a tremendous scarf of white. "Maud," I said, "Maud." She turned her head and beheld the sight. "It cannot be Alaska," she cried. "Alas, no," I answered, and asked, "Can you swim?" She shook her head. "Neither can I said, "so we must get ashore without swimming, in some opening between the rocks through which we can drive the boat and clamber out. But we must be quick, most quick and sure." I spoke with a confidence she knew I did not feel, for she looked at me with that unfaltering gaze of hers, and said, "I have not thanked you yet for all you have done for me, but—" She hesitated, as if in doubt how best to word her gratitude. "Well?" I said brutally, for I was not quite pleased with her thanking me. "You might help me," she smiled. "To acknowledge your obligations before you die? Not at all. We are not going to die. We shall land on that island, and we shall be snug and sheltered before the day is done." I spoke stoutly, but I did not believe a word. Nor was I prompted to lie through fear. I felt no fear, though I was sure of death in that boiling surge amongst the rocks that was rapidly growing nearer. It was impossible to hoist sail and claw off that shore. The wind would instantly capsize the boat, the seas would swamp it the moment it fell into the trough, and besides, the sail, lashed to the spare oars, dragged in the sea ahead of us. As I said, I was not afraid to meet my own death there, a few hundred yards to leeward, but I was appalled at the thought that Maud must die. My cursed imagination saw her beaten and mangled against the rocks, and it was too terrible. I strove to compel myself to think we would make the landing safely, and so I spoke, not what I believed, but what I preferred to believe. I recoiled before contemplation of that frightful death, and for a moment I entertained the wild idea of seizing Maud in my arms and leaping overboard. Then I resolved to wait, and at the last moment, when we entered on the final stretch, to take her in my arms and proclaim my love, and, with her in my embrace, to make the desperate struggle and die. Instinctively we drew closer in the bottom of the boat. I felt her mittened hand come out to mine. And thus, without speech, we waited for the end. We were not far off the line the wind made with the western edge of the promontory, and I watched in the hope that some set of the current or send of the sea would drift us past before we reached the surf. "We shall go clear," I said, with a confidence which I knew deceived neither of us. "By God, we will go clear!" I cried 5 minutes later. The oath left my lips in my excitement, the first, I do believe, in my life, unless "trouble it," an expletive of my youth, be accounted an oath. "I beg your pardon," I said. "You have convinced me of your sincerity," she said, with a faint smile. "I do know, now, that we shall go clear." I had seen a distant headland past the extreme edge of the promontory, and as we looked I could see the intervening coastline of what was evidently a deep cove. At the same time there broke upon our ears a continuous and mighty bellowing. It partook of the magnitude and volume of distant thunder, and it came to us directly from leeward, rising above the crash of the surf and travelling directly in the teeth of the storm. As we passed the point the whole cove burst upon our view, a half-moon of white sandy beach upon which broke a huge surf and which was covered with myriads of seals. It was from them that the great bellowing went up. "A rookery!" I cried. "Now we are indeed saved. There must be men and cruisers to protect them from the seal hunters. Perhaps there is a station ashore." But as I studied the surf which beat upon the beach, I said, "Still bad, but not so bad. And now, if the gods be truly kind, we shall drift by that next headland and come upon a perfectly sheltered beach where we may land without wetting our feet." And the gods were kind. The first and second headlands were directly in line with the southwest wind, but once around the second, and we went perilously near, we picked up the third headland, still in line with the wind and with the other two. But the cove that intervened! It penetrated deep into the land, and the tide, setting in, drifted us under the shelter of the point. Here the sea was calm, save for a heavy but smooth ground swell, and I took in the sea anchor and began to row. From the point the shore curved away, more and more to the south and west, till at last it disclosed a cove within the cove, a little landlocked harbour, the water level as a pond, broken only by tiny ripples, where vagrant breaths and wisps of the storm hurled down from over the frowning wall of rock that backed the beach 100 yards inshore. Here were no seals whatever. The boat's stern touched the hard shingle. I sprang out, extending my hand to Maud. The next moment she was beside me. As my fingers released hers, she clutched for my arm hastily. At the same moment I swayed, as about to fall on the sand. This was the startling effect of the cessation of motion. We had been so long upon the moving, rocking sea that the stable land was a shock to us. We expected the beach to lift up this way and that, and the rocky walls to swing back and forth like the sides of a ship, and when we braced ourselves, automatically, for those various expected movements, their non-occurrence quite overcame our equilibrium. "I really must sit down," Maud said with a nervous laugh and a dizzy gesture, and forthwith she sat down on the sand. I attended to making the boat secure and joined her. Thus we landed on Endeavour Island as we came to it, land sick from long custom of the sea. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Sea Wolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sea Wolf by Jack London. Chapter 29. "Fool!" I cried aloud in my vexation. I had unloaded the boat and carried its contents high upon the beach where I had set about making a camp. There was driftwood, though not much, on the beach, and the sight of a coffee tin I had taken from the Ghost's larder had given me the idea of a fire. "Blithering idiot!" I was continuing. But Maud said, "Tut, tut," in gentle reproval, and then asked why I was a blithering idiot. "No matches," I groaned. "Not a match did I bring. And now we shall have no hot coffee, soup, tea, or anything." "Wasn't it Crusoe who rubbed sticks together?" she drawled. "But I have read the personal narratives of a score of shipwrecked men who tried, and tried in vain," I answered. "I remember Winters, a newspaper fellow with an Alaskan and Siberian reputation. Met him at the Bibelot once, and he was telling us how he attempted to make a fire with a couple of sticks. It was most amusing. He told it inimitably, but it was the story of a failure. I remember his conclusion, his black eyes flashing as he said, 'Gentlemen, the South Sea Islanders may do it, the Malay may do it, but take my word, it's beyond the white man.'" "Oh, well, we've managed so far without it," she said cheerfully, "and there's no reason we cannot still manage without it." "But think of the coffee!" I cried. "It's good coffee, too, I know. I took it from Larsen's private stores. And look at that good wood." I confess I wanted the coffee badly, and I learned, not long afterward, that the berry was likewise a little weakness of Maud's. Besides, we had been so long on a cold diet that we were numb inside as well as out. Anything warm would have been most gratifying. But I complained no more, and set about making a tent of the sail for Maud. I had looked upon it as a simple task, what of the oars, mast, boom, and sprit, to say nothing of plenty of lines. But, as I was without experience, and as every detail was an experiment, and every successful detail an invention, the day was well gone before her shelter was an accomplished fact. And then, that night, it rained, and she was flooded out and driven back into the boat. The next morning I dug a shallow ditch around the tent, and, an hour later, a sudden gust of wind, whipping over the rocky wall behind us, picked up the tent and smashed it down on the sand 30 yards away. Maud laughed at my crestfallen expression, and I said, "As soon as the wind abates I intend going in the boat to explore the island. There must be a station somewhere, and men. And ships must visit the station. Some government must protect all these seals. But I wish to have you comfortable before I start." "I should like to go with you," was all she said. "It would be better if you remained. You have had enough of hardship. It is a miracle that you have survived. And it won't be comfortable in the boat rowing and sailing in this rainy weather. What you need is rest, and I should like you to remain and get it." Something suspiciously akin to moistness dimmed her beautiful eyes before she dropped them and partly turned away her head. "I should prefer going with you," she said in a low voice in which there was just a hint of appeal. "I might be able to help you, her voice broke, "a little. And if anything should happen to you, think of me left here alone." "Oh, I intend being very careful," I answered, "and I shall not go so far but what I can get back before night. Yes, all said and done, I think it vastly better for you to remain and sleep and rest and do nothing." She turned and looked me in the eyes. Her gaze was unfaltering but soft. "Please, please," she said, oh so softly. I stiffened myself to refuse and shook my head. Still she waited and looked at me. I tried to word my refusal, but wavered. I saw the glad light spring into her eyes and knew that I had lost. It was impossible to say no after that. The wind died down in the afternoon, and we were preparing to start the following morning. There was no way of penetrating the island from our cove, for the walls rose perpendicularly from the beach, and on either side of the cove rose from the deep water. Morning broke dull and grey but calm, and I was awake early and had the boat in readiness. "Fool! Imbecile! Yahoo!" I shouted, when I thought it was meet to arouse Maud, but this time I shouted in merriment as I danced about the beach, bareheaded in mock despair. Her head appeared under the flap of the sail. "What now?" she asked sleepily, and withal curiously. "Coffee!" I cried. "What do you say to a cup of coffee? Hot coffee, piping hot?" "My!" she murmured. "You startled me, and you are cruel. Here I have been composing my soul to do without it, and here you are vexing me with your vain suggestions." "Watch me," I said. From under clefts among the rocks I gathered a few dry sticks and chips. These I whittled into shavings or split into kindling. From my notebook I tore out a page, and from the ammunition box took a shotgun shell. Removing the wads from the latter with my knife, I emptied the powder on a flat rock. Next I pried the primer, or cap, from the shell, and laid it on the rock in the midst of the scattered powder. All was ready. Maud still watched from the tent. Holding the paper in my left hand, I smashed down upon the cap with the rock held in my right. There was a puff of white smoke, a burst of flame, and the rough edge of the paper was alight. Maud clapped her hands gleefully. "Prometheus!" she cried. But I was too occupied to acknowledge her delight. The feeble flame must be cherished tenderly if it were to gather strength and live. I fed it, shaving by shaving, and sliver by sliver, till at last it was snapping and crackling as it laid hold of the smaller chips and sticks. To be cast away on an island had not entered into my calculations, so we were without a kettle or cooking utensil of any sort, but I made shift with a tin used for bailing the boat, and later, as we consumed our supply of canned goods, we accumulated quite an imposing array of cooking vessels. I boiled the water, but it was Maud who made the coffee. And how good it was! My contribution was canned beef fried with crumbled sea biscuit and water. The breakfast was a success, and we sat about the fire much longer than enterprising explorers should have done, sipping the hot black coffee and talking over our situation. I was confident that we should find a station in some of the coves, for I knew that the rookeries of Bering Sea were thus guarded, but Maud advanced the theory, to prepare me for disappointment, I do believe, if disappointment were to come, that we had discovered an unknown rookery. She was in very good spirits, however, and made quite merry in accepting our plight as a grave one. "If you are right," I said, "then we must prepare to winter here. Our food will not last, but there are the seals. They go away in the fall, so I must soon begin to lay in a supply of meat. Then there will be huts to build and driftwood to gather. Also, we shall try out seal fat for lighting purposes. Altogether we'll have our hands full if we find the island uninhabited. Which we shall not, I know." But she was right. We sailed with a beam wind along the shore, searching the coves with our glasses and landing occasionally without finding a sign of human life. Yet we learned that we were not the first who had landed on Endeavour Island. High up on the beach of the second cove from ours, we discovered the splintered wreck of a boat. A sealer's boat, for the rowlocks were bound in sennit, a gun rack was on the starboard side of the bow, and in white letters was faintly visible Gazelle No. 2. The boat had lain there for a long time, for it was half filled with sand, and the splintered wood had that weather-worn appearance due to long exposure to the elements. In the stern sheets I found a rusty 10-gauge shotgun, and a sailor's sheath knife broken short across and so rusted as to be almost unrecognizable. "They got away," I said cheerfully, but I felt a sinking at the heart and seemed to divine the presence of bleached bones somewhere on that beach. I did not wish Maud's spirits to be dampened by such a find, so I turned seaward again with our boat and skirted the northeastern point of the island. There were no beaches on the southern shore, and by early afternoon we rounded the black promontory and completed the circumnavigation of the island. I estimated its circumference at 25 miles, its width as varying from 2 to 5 miles, while my most conservative calculation placed on its beaches 200,000 seals. The island was highest at its extreme southwestern point, the headlands and backbone diminishing regularly until the northeastern portion was only a few feet above the sea. With the exception of our little cove, the other beaches sloped gently back for a distance of half a mile or so into what I might call rocky meadows, with here and there patches of moss and tundra grass. Here the seals hauled out, and the old bulls guarded their harems, while the young bulls hauled out by themselves. This brief description is all that Endeavour Island merits. Damp and soggy where it was not sharp and rocky, buffeted by storm winds and lashed by the sea, with the air continually a-tremble with the bellowing of 200,000 amphibians, it was a melancholy and miserable sojourning place. Maud, who had prepared me for disappointment, and who had been sprightly and vivacious all day, broke down as we landed in our own little cove. She strove bravely to hide it from me, but while I was kindling another fire, I knew she was stifling her sobs in the blanket under the sail tent. It was my turn to be cheerful, and I played the part to the best of my ability, and with such success that I brought the laughter back into her dear eyes and song on her lips, for she sang to me before she went to an early bed. It was the first time I had heard her sing, and I lay by the fire listening and transported, for she was nothing if not an artist in everything she did, and her voice, though not strong, was wonderfully sweet and expressive. I still slept in the boat, and I lay awake long that night, gazing up at the first stars I had seen in many nights and pondering the situation. Responsibility of this sort was a new thing to me. Wolf Larsen had been quite right. I had stood on my father's legs. My lawyers and agents had taken care of my money for me. I had had no responsibilities at all. Then, on the Ghost I had learned to be responsible for myself. And now, for the first time in my life, I found myself responsible for someone else. And it was required of me that this should be the gravest of responsibilities, for she was the one woman in the world, the one small woman, as I loved to think of her. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Sea Wolf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sea Wolf by Jack London. Chapter 30. No wonder we called it Endeavour Island. For 2 weeks we toiled at building a hut. Maud insisted on helping, and I could have wept over her bruised and bleeding hands. And still, I was proud of her because of it. There was something heroic about this gently bred woman enduring our terrible hardship, and with her pittance of strength bending to the tasks of a peasant woman. She gathered many of the stones which I built into the walls of the hut. Also she turned a deaf ear to my entreaties when I begged her to desist. She compromised, however, by taking upon herself the lighter labors of cooking and gathering driftwood and moss for our winter's supply. The hut's walls rose without difficulty, and everything went smoothly until the problem of the roof confronted me. Of what use was 4 walls without a roof? And of what could a roof be made? There were the spare oars, very true. They would serve as roof beams, but with what was I to cover them? Moss would never do. Tundra grass was impracticable. We needed the sail for the boat, and the tarpaulin had begun to leak. Winters used walrus skins on his hut, I said. There are the seals, she suggested. So next day the hunting began. I did not know how to shoot, but I proceeded to learn, and when I had expended some 30 shells for 3 seals, I decided that the ammunition would be exhausted before I acquired the necessary knowledge. I had used 8 shells for lighting fires before I hit upon the device of banking the embers with wet moss, and there remained not over 100 shells in the box. "We must club the seals," I announced, when convinced of my poor marksmanship. "I have heard the sealers talk about clubbing them." "They are so pretty," she objected. "I cannot bear to think of it being done. It is so directly brutal, you know, so different from shooting them." "The roof must go on," I answered grimly. "Winter is almost here. It is our lives against theirs. It is unfortunate we haven't plenty of ammunition, but I think, anyway, that they suffer less from being clubbed than from being all shot up. Besides, I shall do the clubbing." "That's just it," she began eagerly, and broke off in sudden confusion. "Of course," I began, "if you prefer—" "But what shall I be doing?" she interrupted, with a softness that I knew full well to be insistence. "Gathering firewood and cooking dinner," I answered lightly. She shook her head. "It is too dangerous for you to attempt alone." I know," she waved my protest. "I am only a weak woman, but just my small assistance may enable you to escape disaster." "But the clubbing?" I suggested. "Of course, you will do that. I shall probably scream. I'll look away when—" "The danger is most serious," I laughed. "I shall use my judgment when to look and when not to look," she replied with a grand air. The upshot of the affair was that she accompanied me. Next morning I rowed into the adjoining cove and up to the edge of the beach. There were seals all about us in the water, and the bellowing thousands on the beach compelled us to shout at each other to make ourselves heard. "I know men club them," I said, trying to reassure myself, and gazing doubtfully at a large bull, not 30 feet away, upreared on his 4 flippers and regarding me intently. "But the question is, how do they club them?" "Let us gather tundra grass and thatch the roof," Maud said. She was as frightened as I at the prospect, and we had reason to be gazing at close range at the gleaming teeth and dog-like mouths. "I had always thought they were afraid of men," I said. "How do I know they are not afraid?" I queried a moment later, after having rowed a few more strokes along the beach. Perhaps, if I were to step boldly ashore, they would cut for it, and I could not catch up with one, and still I hesitated. "I heard of a man once who invaded the nesting grounds of wild geese," Maud said. "They killed him." "The geese?" "Yes, the geese. My brother told me about it when I was a little girl." "But I know men club them," I persisted. "I think the tundra grass would make just as good a roof," she said. Far from her intention, her words were maddening me, driving me on. I could not play the coward before her eyes. "Here goes," I said, packing water with one oar and running the bow ashore. I stepped out and advanced valiantly upon a long-maned bull in the midst of his wives. I was armed with the regular club with which the boat pullers killed the wounded seals gaffed aboard by the hunters. It was only a foot and a half long, and in my supreme ignorance I never dreamed that the club used ashore when raiding the rookeries measured 4 to 5 feet. The cows lumbered out of my way, and the distance between me and the bull decreased. He raised himself on his flippers with an angry movement. We were a dozen feet apart. Still I advanced steadily, looking for him to turn tail at any moment and run. At 6 feet the panicky thought rushed into my mind, what if he will not run? Why then I shall club him, came the answer. In my fear I had forgotten that I was there to get the bull instead of to make him run. And just then he gave a snort and a snarl and rushed at me. His eyes were blazing, his mouth was wide open, the teeth gleamed cruelly white. Without shame I confess that it was I who turned and footed it. He ran awkwardly, but he ran well. He was but 2 paces behind when I tumbled into the boat, and as I shoved off with an oar, his teeth crunched down upon the blade. The stout wood was crushed like an eggshell. Maud and I were astounded. A moment later he had dived under the boat, seized the keel in his mouth, and was shaking the boat violently. "My!" said Maud. "Let's go back." I shook my head. I can do what other men have done, and I know that other men have clubbed seals. But I think I'll leave the bulls alone next time. "I wish you wouldn't," she said. "Now don't say 'please, please,'" I cried, half angrily, I do believe. She made no reply, and I knew my tone must have hurt her. "I beg your pardon," I said, or shouted, rather, in order to make myself heard above the roar of the rookery. "If you say so, I'll turn and go back, but honestly I'd rather stay." "Now don't say this is what you get for bringing a woman along," she said. She smiled at me whimsically, gloriously, and I knew there was no need for forgiveness. I rowed a couple of 100 feet along the shore so as to recover my nerves, and then stepped ashore again. "Do be cautious," she called after me. I nodded my head and proceeded to make a flank attack on the nearest harem. All went well until I aimed a blow at an outlying cow's head and fell short. She snorted and tried to scramble away. I ran in close and struck another blow, hitting the shoulder instead of the head. "Watch out!" I heard Maud scream. In my excitement I had not been taking notice of other things, and I looked up to see the lord of the harem charging down upon me. Again I fled to the boat, hotly pursued, but this time Maud made no suggestion of turning back. "It would be better, I imagine, if you let the harems alone and devoted your attention to lonely and inoffensive-looking seals," was what she said. "I think I have read something about them. Dr. Jordan's book, I believe. They are the young bulls, not old enough to have harems of their own. He called them holluschickie, or something like that. It seems to me if we find where they haul out—" "It seems to me your fighting instinct is aroused," I laughed. She flushed quickly and prettily. "I'll admit I don't like defeat any more than you do, or any more than I like the idea of killing such pretty, inoffensive creatures." "Pretty!" I sniffed. I failed to mark anything preeminently pretty about those foamy-mouthed beasts that raced me. "Your point of view," she laughed. "You lacked perspective. Now if you did not have to get so close to the subject—" "The very thing," I cried. "What I need is a longer club, and there's that broken oar ready to hand." "It just comes to me," she said, "that Captain Larsen was telling me how the men raided the rookeries. They drive the seals, in small herds, a short distance inland before they kill them." "I don't care to undertake the herding of one of those harems," I objected. "But there are the holluschickie," she said. "The holluschickie haul out by themselves, and Dr. Jordan says the paths are left between the harems, and that as long as the holluschickie keep strictly to the path, They are unmolested by the masters of the harem. "There's one now," I said, pointing to a young bull in the water. "Let's watch him and follow him if he hauls out." He swam directly to the beach and clambered out into a small opening between two harems, the masters of which made warning noises but did not attack him. We watched him travel slowly inward, threading about among the harems along what must have been the path. "Here goes," I said, stepping out, but I confess my heart was in my mouth as I thought of going through the heart of that monstrous herd. "It would be wise to make the boat fast," Maud said. She had stepped out beside me, and I regarded her with wonderment. She nodded her head determinedly. "Yes, I'm going with you, so you may as well secure the boat and arm me with a club." "Let's go back," I said dejectedly. "I think tundra grass will do, after all." "You know it won't," was her reply. "Shall I lead?" With a shrug of the shoulders, but with the warmest admiration and pride at heart for this woman, I equipped her with the broken oar and took another for myself. It was with nervous trepidation that we made the first few rods of the journey. Once Maud screamed in terror as a cow thrust an inquisitive nose toward her foot, and several times I quickened my pace for the same reason. But, beyond warning coughs from either side, there were no signs of hostility. It was a rookery which had never been raided by the hunters, and in consequence the seals were mild-tempered and at the same time unafraid. In the very heart of the herd the din was terrific. It was almost dizzying in its effect. I paused and smiled reassuringly at Maud, for I had recovered my equanimity sooner than she. I could see she was still badly frightened. She came close to me and shouted, "I'm dreadfully afraid." And I was not. Though the novelty had not yet worn off, the peaceful comportment of the seals had quieted my alarm. Maud was trembling. "I'm afraid and I'm not afraid," she chattered with shaking jaws. "It's my miserable body, not I." It's all right," I reassured her, my arm passing instinctively and protectively around her. I shall never forget, in that moment, how instantly conscious I became of my manhood. The primitive deeps of my nature stirred. I felt myself masculine, the protector of the weak, the fighting male. And best of all, I felt myself the protector of my loved one. She leaned against me, so light and lily-frail, and as her trembling eased away it seemed as though I became aware of prodigious strength. I felt myself a match for the most ferocious bull in the herd, and I know had such a bull charged upon me that I should have met it unflinchingly and quite coolly, and I know that I should have killed it. "I am all right now," she said, looking up at me gratefully. "Let us go on." And that the strength in me had quieted her and given her confidence filled me with an exultant joy. The youth of the race seemed burgeoning in me, over-civilized man that I was, and I lived for myself the old hunting days and forest nights of my remote and forgotten ancestry. I had much for which to thank Wolf Larsen, was my thought as we went along the path between the jostling harems. A quarter of a mile inland we came upon the holluschickie, sleek young bulls living out the loneliness of their bachelorhood and gathering strength against the day when they would fight their way into the ranks of the Benedicts. Everything now went smoothly. I seemed to know just what to do and how to do it. Shouting, making threatening gestures with my club, and even prodding the lazy ones, I quickly cut out a score of the young bachelors from their companions. Whenever one made an attempt to break back toward the water, I headed it off. Maud took an active part in the drive, and with her cries and flourishings of the broken oar was of considerable assistance. I noticed, though, that whenever one looked tired and lagged, she let it slip past. But I noticed also, whenever one with a show of fight tried to break past, that her eyes glinted and showed bright, and she rapped it smartly with her club. "My, it's exciting!" she cried, pausing from sheer weakness. "I think I'll sit down." I drove the little herd, a dozen strong now, what of the escapes she had permitted. 100 yards further on, and by the time she joined me I had finished the slaughter and was beginning to skin. An hour later we went proudly back along the path between the harems, and twice again we came down the path burdened with skins till I thought we had enough to roof the hut. I set the sail, laid one tack out of the cove, and on the other tack made our own little inner cove. "It's just like homecoming," Maud said as I ran the boat ashore. I heard her words with a responsive thrill. It was all so dearly intimate and natural, and I said, "It seems as though I have lived this life always. The world of books and bookish folks is very vague, more like a dream memory than an actuality. I surely have hunted and forayed and fought all the days of my life. And you, too, seem a part of it. You are," I was on the verge of saying my woman, my mate, but glibly changed it to "standing the hardship well." But her ear had caught the flaw. She recognized a flight that mid-boast broke. She gave me a quick look. "Not that. You were saying—" "That the American Mrs. Meynell was living the life of a savage and living it quite successfully," I said easily. "Oh," was all she replied, but I could have sworn there was a note of disappointment in her voice. But my woman, my mate, kept ringing in my head for the rest of the day and for many days. Yet never did it ring more loudly than that night as I watched her draw back the blanket of moss from the coals, blow up the fire, and cook the evening meal. It must have been latent savagery stirring in me, for the old words so bound up with the roots of the race to grip me and thrill me. And grip and thrill they did till I fell asleep, murmuring them to myself over and over again. End of chapter 30.